By sunrise, Frank Dalton's peach orchard looked as though it had been dipped in glass. Frozen blossoms hung from dark branches, the smallest fruit buds had turned black, and workers moved silently through rows that had been pink only the day before. Across the road, smoke no longer rose from Emily Carter's property. She had no wind machines, no propane heaters, and no crew large enough to fight the cold. Yet in the center of her orchard, several rows still carried pale flowers and living green buds. Between the trees stood dozens of black barrels filled with water. Frank stopped beside one surviving branch and pressed a flower between his fingers. The center was still green. If you enjoy stories about unusual farm ideas, abandoned land, and people who refuse to accept that failure is permanent, subscribe and stay with us. Only 6 months earlier, Frank had laughed when 26-year-old Emily paid $6,800 for the abandoned orchard known as the Frost Bowl. The property sat in a shallow Colorado valley where cold air rolled down from surrounding hills and settled between the trees. 3 owners had lost their crops to late spring freezes. One installed heaters and went bankrupt buying fuel. Another rented wind machines that arrived too late. The third stopped pruning, stopped irrigating, and finally walked away. Emily bought the land with money left after her father's death. Along with it, she kept his weather notebooks, an old toolbox, and years of observations about frost. Frank told her the orchard did not need another owner, it needed to be moved uphill. Emily looked across the neglected rows and noticed something the previous owners had ignored. A few trees beside an old water tank still carried dead fruit stems from the previous season. The tank had been empty for years, but her father's notes contained one underlined sentence. Water remembers the sun longer than soil does. Emily did not yet know how much that sentence was worth. She only knew she had bought an orchard that bloomed beautifully every spring and died in a single night. Emily found the black barrels at the closing sale of a commercial greenhouse. They were scratched, faded, and coated with mineral stains. Most farmers saw damaged plastic. Emily saw containers capable of holding hundreds of gallons of water. She bought 48 barrels for less than the cost of renting one orchard heater for a night. When she rolled them between the peach trees, Frank's workers stopped along the road to watch. The dark containers made the orchard look like a storage yard. Frank asked whether she planned to grow peaches or breed mosquitoes. Emily ignored him and created a test. 4 rows received barrels. 4 similar rows remained unchanged. She placed temperature sensors near the trunks, at flower height, and in the open spaces between trees. Every barrel was filled from an old irrigation pond. Her first design failed. Emily filled several barrels almost to the top and sealed them tightly. A sudden cold night froze the upper layer of water. 2 weakened barrels split along their sides. Another tipped when the wet soil softened beneath it, sending water across the roots. Worse, most barrels stood too far from the trees. The sensors showed that the water remained warmer than the air, but almost none of that heat reached the blossoms. A light frost damaged flowers in both the protected and unprotected rows. Frank found one cracked barrel beside the road. He told Emily that she had discovered a very expensive way to make ice. For several hours, she considered selling the remaining barrels and cutting her losses. Then, she checked every sensor again. 2 trees had recorded slightly warmer temperatures. Their barrels had been placed closer together, near the trunks, where an old wooden fence blocked the wind. The difference was small, but during frost, a small difference could decide whether the center of a flower lived or died. Emily emptied the damaged barrels and began moving the rest. Emily stopped trying to protect the entire orchard. Instead, she selected the healthiest trees in the lowest and coldest section of the property. She grouped the barrels around them, left space for the water to expand, and anchored each container inside a simple wooden frame. She placed dark stones around the bases to absorb more sunlight. Low panels made from old greenhouse material blocked wind near the trunks without covering the branches. During the day, the black barrels warmed. After sunset, the water cooled much more slowly than the surrounding soil and air. The new system still looked ridiculous from the road. Frank's workers called the rows Emily's barrel maze. But the next cold night produced different numbers. The unprotected rows dropped below the danger point first. The air near the grouped barrels remained slightly warmer for several hours. The effect weakened farther from the containers, proving that Emily could not heat whole acres with a few tanks of water. She did not need to. She needed to preserve enough blossoms to create a crop. Emily continued improving the layout. She removed barrels from windy locations and concentrated them around selected trees. She tracked which groups received the most afternoon sun and which lost heat too quickly after midnight. A mild frost arrived while the earliest peach varieties were blooming. Some flowers died throughout the orchard. Even the barrel rows suffered damage. Yet, when Emily cut open the flower centers, she found more green tissue near the clustered water containers. For the first time, the experiment produced something visible. Tiny green fruit began forming on several protected branches. Frank inspected the trees and admitted the barrels might have helped during a weak frost. He still believed a serious freeze would destroy everything. Emily knew he could be right. Her system did not create heat. It only stored a limited amount gathered during the day. Then the Weather Service warned that an Arctic front was moving toward the valley during full bloom. The predicted temperature was far lower than anything her experiment had faced. Frank Dalton prepared as though the orchard were going to war. He rented additional wind machines, ordered propane, and hired workers to place heaters between his most valuable rows. The equipment cost more for one night than Emily had paid for her entire property. Emily had no such options. She filled every barrel, checked the wooden frames, repaired the wind panels, and positioned sensors throughout the protected section. She knew the barrels could not save trees exposed to open wind, so she abandoned several outer rows and concentrated everything around the strongest blocks. The temperature fell soon after sunset. By midnight, frost covered the grass. The black barrels released their stored warmth slowly, but the air continued growing colder. Several containers near the edge of the orchard lost heat too quickly. Flowers there froze before dawn. Emily walked between the trees with a flashlight, watching the sensor readings fall. She could hear Frank's wind machines across the road and see the glow of his heaters. Then the wind changed. Cold air settled heavily into the valley floor. Frank's machines mixed air that was almost equally cold at every height, while fuel began running low in several heating rows. Inside Emily's protected blocks, the barrels continued releasing the day's heat. The difference was only a few degrees, and it did not last everywhere. But near the clustered containers, the flowers remained just above the temperature that would destroy their centers. At sunrise, much of Emily's orchard was lost. The outer rows had blackened. Several barrel groups had failed. Trees in poorly sheltered areas looked no better than the unprotected controls. But the central rows still held living blossoms. Frank crossed the road without laughing. He asked to see the sensors. Emily showed him that the barrels had not heated the orchard. They had delayed the deepest cold long enough for part of the crop to survive. For one night, a few degrees had become the most valuable thing in the valley. Within a week, the difference could be seen from the road. Dead blossoms fell from the unprotected trees. Frank's damaged rows produced only scattered fruit. Across the valley, growers reported losses so severe that many expected no commercial harvest. Around Emily's black barrels, green peaches continued growing. Her surviving crop was not large. She had saved only a fraction of the orchard, and some fruit later dropped because the damaged trees could not support it. But local peaches became scarce that year. Restaurants competed for the first boxes. A regional grocery chain bought the largest fruit. Smaller peaches went to a jam producer, and visitors came to the farm after hearing about the strange barrels standing between the trees. For the first time, the Frost Bowl paid its taxes and repair bills. Agricultural researchers visited the orchard and studied Emily's records. They confirmed that the barrels had created a local thermal buffer during the coldest hours. They also confirmed the limitations. The system could not defeat a long freeze. Wind could carry the stored warmth away. Poorly positioned barrels provided almost no protection. Water volume, sunlight, tree spacing, and shelter all mattered. Emily turned those limitations into a business. She developed small frost protection plans for family orchards that could not afford industrial equipment. Her company calculated where to place water containers, how much volume was needed, which trees deserved priority, and where wind barriers would make the greatest difference. Frank became one of her first local clients. Over the following years, Emily's systems appeared in small peach, cherry, apricot, and plum orchards. Income from fruit, installations, monitoring equipment, and regional contracts eventually reached several $1 million. The black barrels never became magical machines. They remained simple containers filled with water. Their value came from a young woman who understood that saving an entire orchard was not always necessary. Sometimes survival began by protecting a few rows, preserving one harvest, and refusing to laugh at an idea before the coldest night arrived.